Welcome to A Push. As opposed to my marathon video on Washington last time, we're going to try to keep the Adams administration one short and sweet. It's also easier because, of course, Adams only served one term as comparison to Washington's two. But before this gets away from me, here are your main objectives for today. Take a moment and make sure you clearly understand them, and we'll be back to them at the end. So, the Adams administration is the advent of what we call the first party system, the first divide between two political parties in the United States. Again, we'll spend a lot of time talking about this, but the Federalists were in favor of, in general, a stronger central government, a broad interpretation of the Constitution, favoring banking, commercial, and industrial interests, and on the side of England in the French Revolutionary Wars. The Republicans, in general, were on the side of smaller federal government and larger state and local governments, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They were more in favor of agriculturalists and less in favor of industry, and in general supported France. And so the Federalists are often painted as the party of the elite, whereas the Republicans are the party of the small farmer, but that doesn't totally work. But make sure you at least understand the various issues involved here. Obviously, Washington was somewhat unhappy about this, considering he had just had Hamilton write that whole farewell address thing for him, where he warned against partisan fighting. And here we are trying to tear down the foundations of the country right away. But in a winner take all electoral system, there were always going to be differences and there were always going to be parties. And so Washington's out of power. We can now ignore parts of his advice and go on to trying to destroy each other. In the tools for trying to destroy each other were in general partisan newspapers, which both parties started and both parties used to try to attack the other. And so we get a lot of very salacious stories, all-out attacks, and just in general, really, really unpleasant conduct, although that's really going to ramp up during Adams's administration. The run-up to the election of 1796 was actually much more calm than that. So here's 1796. The electoral map sort of oversimplifies it, but here we go. In general, the Federalists won the northern and eastern areas, whereas the Republicans won the southern and western areas. And of course, it's far more complicated. Again, every elector gets two votes, and so all these other people also got votes. But what you get is John Adams, who was Washington's vice president and the Colossus of Independence, as the president, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, as the vice president. If you think it's kind of weird to have a president and vice president of different parties, so did they. And so this is the last time that's going to happen because, man, that really doesn't work. At the same time, what you started to see is increasing Republican control of Congress. And so in the beginning, you had split government as far as the Washington administration, with Republicans controlling the House of Representatives and Federalists controlling the Senate. And then over time, Republicans are going to take control of both houses, and this is going to spell doom for the Federalists. The other event, of course, that spells doom for the Federalists is the fall of Alexander Hamilton, who fell from power for a variety of different reasons, most salaciously because he had an affair with James Reynolds' wife and then was accused of bribery and corruption, and so had to publish the whole of the details of the affair, which shocked the sensibilities of the Americans of the time. So the Reynolds pamphlet was definitely a factor, but also the factor that Hamilton was a jerk and hated John Adams, and Adams hated him. And so Adams would fire him, and Hamilton would say a bunch of mean things about Adams, including this guy. This one I enjoy. And of course, Adams would then call Hamilton a bastard, and that's about it for Alexander Hamilton. He's going to fall from power, although he will be invited back in to lead the army once Washington demurs. The main issue that Adams was dealing with during his administration was the French Revolution, which was the main issue that the entire world was dealing with, because, of course, we had an eternal alliance with France, and France was at war with everyone else in Europe at this time. And so as Napoleon took over and it started to expand French power, there was a real question as to what our role was going to be in this whole thing. The Adams administration, because of their Federalist leanings, wanted to be closer with England, and because Jay's Treaty somewhat normalized our relations with England, we actually fought a undeclared war against revolutionary France called the Quasi War. It was mostly a naval war, but we did raise a standing army during this time period, and that army was placed under the command of Alexander Hamilton. They had tried to get Washington to lead it, but he was too old at this point, and he would die within 2 years. And so Hamilton became the commander of this new standing American army, which was another point of contention with the Jeffersonian Republicans, of course. And Hamilton, being our most decorated military officer, prepared in case we had to go to war with revolutionary France. But for the most part, the Quasi War was a naval conflict with our Coast Guard and our newly commissioned Navy fighting with French ships in the Atlantic as Napoleon tried to enforce his continental, I guess we're not to the continental system yet, but as the French preyed on American shipping and, as especially American shipping going to England. The XYZ affair was another thing that put a nail in the coffin of our relationship with France. The XYZ affair were American diplomats who went to try to negotiate a treaty like Jay's treaty with France, but they ran into the massive corruption of the French Directory, and specifically Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who demanded a bribe from the Americans in order to try to negotiate some sort of treaty. This was very common in European politics, but it outraged the noble and Republican Americans who refused to pay the bribe. And then this became a larger international incident when the Jeffersonians foolishly pressured the Adams administration to release the correspondence, which showed that France was every bit as corrupt and as unreasonable as Adams had been painting them to be. And so the XYZ affair kicked off a wave of anti-French hysteria, where the French were portrayed as villains and looters and basically anarchists, as you can see here. They're eating frogs and guillotining people. And so what we get is the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were acts to crack down on American Jacobin activity and also on French immigrants who we suspected were trying to stir up French revolutionary zeal in the United States. The Alien Act allowed the president to deport any immigrant considered dangerous to the country, read French, and also significantly increased the amount of time someone had to wait for citizenship. So the goal is to stop people from voting for Democratic Republicans, and also, of course, to limit the power of the French. The Sedition Act is a little bit more problematic because it threw people in jail for criticizing the government. So that's a little bit of an issue, considering the First Amendment clearly says that you should have freedom of speech, and now the Sedition Act is allowing the Adams administration to throw critics and newspaper writers in jail. But Adams had relatively broad support for these bills because of the anti-French sentiment kicked up by both the Quasi War and the XYZ affair. Jefferson and the Republicans protested this by writing the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The Kentucky resolution was actually written by Jefferson and the Virginia one written by Madison, which articulated the doctrine of nullification, which is something that's going to come up again and again. Nullification says that if the government passes a law that's unconstitutional, the states have a right to not enforce that law. So it provides a stopgap for states to not enforce unconstitutional laws. But the problem, of course, is if states can nullify laws, what's to stop them? Who's to say what's unconstitutional? Because, of course, the Elastic Clause lays out, potentially situations where interpretation of constitutionality is somewhat questionable. And so the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were the first time we'll see the doctrine of nullification, but not the last. This brings us to the election of 1800, which is where all these issues will eventually be decided. Jefferson is going to run for re-election again, and of course, as is John Adams. And so this election will lay out the electoral framework and basically the direction of the country going forward. There's, of course, a number of other candidates who are going to play a role, but we'll start by telling that story next time and end just with the eve of the election of 1800. So make sure you can clearly and substantively answer these objectives. And this brings us to the end of period 3.